We have had an extraordinary weekend thus far from 8 p.m. on Friday, the 30th of May. It feels like some time ago already. The opening address and opening dinner, a very vigorous presentation of 7 defense ministers on Saturday morning, really detailed discussions in the special sessions, further debate in the afternoon and evening. And this morning, we've had already a very vigorous discussion. This 5th plenary session is on the theme ensuring agile conflict management in the Asia-Pacific. The word agile was one picked by me because of my fascination with the idea of fast power, to which I made some reference on Friday night. I think it is the case that in today's world, speed has become an attribute of power, and we've already had many discussions here about how facts are sometimes quickly created on the ground, at sea, or in the air, to which considered responses have to be made, but even if considered, sometimes also have to be speedy or at least agile. And this session also, being the last session of the Shangri-La Dialogue, offers an opportunity to draw together some of the threads of the debate, and for one or two voices perhaps who haven't yet been heard to contribute also to the discussion. And we have 2 excellent speakers at this concluding session who will again speak in the order in which their names appear on the program. And I would just first wish to advise the gentleman from production that there is a slight problem here with my speaker's computer tablet. So if someone could discreetly come up to fix it while the presentations are being made, I'd appreciate that. But our first speaker is Jean-Yves Drian, the Minister of Defense of France, who is an extraordinarily, the French word is fidèle, loyal supporter of the Shangri-La Dialogue. And his first appearance at the Shangri-La Dialogue was some 16 or 18 days after he became Minister of Defense of France. And he spent 2.5 days here, and he's come to the subsequent Shangri-La Dialogue. And France's experience of the Asia-Pacific is specifically very important. And their livre blanc that emerged at the time made specific reference to the Asia-Pacific. So this is a country that has thought strategically about this region of the world and the relationship between this region and Europe. So it is with real pleasure I invite Jean-Yves Le Drian to take the podium. Thank you very much.
Dear John, dear Dr. Eng, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, let me first thank our hosts, you, John, and the International Institute for Strategic Studies for the perfect organization of this 13th Shangri-La Dialogue, as well as the Singapore government for their splendid hospitality. It's an honor and a pleasure for France to attend this major regular event for security in Asia. Over decades, many people have written a lot about crisis prevention and management, and entire organizations have been focusing on these goals. As the defense minister of a country whose armed forces are deployed on a large number of foreign theaters, let me draw a few lessons learned from France's recent role in preventing or averting crisis in Africa, in the Near East or elsewhere, and then I'll get back to enforcing these lessons to the Asia-Pacific. The first lesson learned is there is no efficient crisis management without a certain type of political determination towards those who challenge peace and security in a region. This determination is indeed the only way to convince players who do not participate in the international interplay in a responsible manner that their deeds will not be tolerated. This determination can be structured around 4 points. First, the firmness of international players. Let us look at the case of the Iranian nuclear crisis. It's the firmness of the international community and of the E3+3 group, its determination to see sanctions adopted at an international level, everyone at its own level, that brought Tehran to understand after a long process that the cost of an open crisis with the rest of the world was no longer affordable, and brought them to the table of negotiations. In Asia, political determination must be displayed towards North Korea so that the UN Security Council's resolution regarding non-proliferation are respected. That means strict enforcement of sanctions and other restrictive measures, which are a mean and not a goal, to make this country see sense when their deeds are a threat to international peace and security. Second point, being decisive. Let me remind this and grab the example of a struggle that concerns all of us in Europe as well as in Asia. Struggle against terrorist combatant groups pretending to act in the name of jihad. This is one of the lessons learned from the French intervention in Mali in 2013. Upon Bamako government's request, the very existence of his country was at stake. The French President, François Hollande, decided of the use of force against the armed terrorist groups who, within a few hours, were swooping down on the major Malian cities and then on the capital city. Because we acted rapidly, we were able to a crisis was avoided. It would have thrown into chaos and barbarity, and it would have cast the whole region into terror and would have even threatened Europe. Of course, to this day, nothing is perfect in Mali, but who, back in January 2013, would have anticipated that presidential and parliament elections could be organized over only a few months, and that a significant recovery effort would be initiated, and that the international community would have deployed their presence so rapidly all over the country. Third point, this determination can only a collective endeavor. Each international crisis, each major internal collapse of a whole state shows this as well. In Mali and in the Central African Republic, the implication of the international community with its organizations stemming from the nation of the United Nations is and will be a determining element to avert any future conflict. Other common security structures can and should be mobilized every time the threat of a conflict arises. And in this respect, each region in the world has its own specificity, as you can witness this here with Asean. I could focus on the Ukraine today in Europe. Resorting to OSCE for the sake of an election that took place last week in the country played a significant role. In the same way, NATO must continue supporting the concrete affirmation of solidarity principles in all the reassuring measures that unite the allies, including in the military aspect. When she participates in all the reassuring measures that were set up for the benefit of the East European allies, France grabs that opportunity to remind of her commitment to the principle of a sturdy common safety underpinned by a reliable and efficient defense structure, and a credible one. Fourth element, will is underpinned by credibility to be efficient. Only reliable players may pretend to participate in conflicts management or conflicts prevention. This is valid both in Europe, Asia, and in the Middle East. This is valid both for the state players, considered individually, as for the international organizations or even NGOs, which can play an increasing role in crisis management. Credibility itself results from legitimacy. Legitimacy of the decision-making processes, legitimacy as regards law, and legitimacy thanks to efficient action, and therefore also an ability to take action in concrete ways. It is indeed our common inability to react to the Syrian conflict, a tragedy for hundreds of thousands of victims, which is potentially dangerous for security in Europe and elsewhere, and brought about the situation we are faced with now. The second lesson that I learned from the French experience is that today crisis management requests a permanent sense of responsibilities. The first responsibility in international order is to act according to law. Among states, just like in any human organization, law, norms are contributing to stability. This means refusing the law of the strongest, refusing power struggle, refusing a zero-sum game in which what is won by one is lost by the other. These are the principles that, according to us, Russia infringed when Russia invaded Crimea and ignored the Budapest Memorandum 1994, where Russia committed herself, along with the United States and the United Kingdom, all three depositories of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, to respect the Ukrainian independence and sovereignty in her current borders, and to refrain from any threat or use of force against the Ukraine, including economic coercion. We know that the Ukrainian crisis is analyzed with great attention in Asia, where fear is gradually increasing that force should prevail over order. This just cannot be. And the UN General Assembly vote on last 27th of March clearly reminded the commitment of the international community to the rule of law. Besides, let me mention that only one Asia-Pacific country voted against the resolution, North Korea, whereas 21 states voted for it. The second responsibility is that of permanent openness, and by principle that of dialogue. Our world and our societies imperatively need more multiform space for dialogue in every crisis, in every possible crisis area, to prevent conflicts. And the Shangri-La Dialogue brings a contribution because all the players are here, and in particular our Chinese friends who are here today. I had the opportunity to say so just a couple of weeks ago when I mentioned Mali. Dialogue between the Malian parties is the condition for stability and preventing further conflicts. The recent incidents that took place in the north of the country only confirm that and remind us how urgent it is to go forward in that field. The stake goes beyond Mali because the whole Sahelian area is at stake. In the same way, in the Central African Republic, we are aware that setting a dialogue with the nation is the prerequisite for bringing stability back into the country. Here as well, the key to a successful dialogue is often its inclusiveness. The regional organizations often provide a framework for such approaches. One can see this in Africa with in the CAR the considerable commitment of the African Union as well as sub-regional organizations. The reconciliation process is therefore proceeding from an internal dialogue between the parties to the conflict, initiated under the impulse of mediation by responsible neighbors. In the Asia-Pacific, there's also a necessity of a dialogue between countries that are brought into conflict because of opposing territorial claims. And to make the dialogue fruitful, all the parties must clearly explain the legal foundations of their claims and accept not only to enter into dialogue, but also to negotiate, like provided for by the UN Charter, without resorting to threats or to the use of force. The third responsibility is the responsibility of good faith and transparency. It is logical, it's natural that countries sometimes disagree. We all have a history, we all have had interests and even ways of thinking that differ. But among us, there must be a basic agreement, minimum basic agreement, which is that international relations must be conducted in good faith. There cannot be any stable international order when some people act in permanent contradiction with the principles they affirm or with reality as we can see it. One cannot shamelessly exploit the general principles developed by others, like the responsibility to protect with expansionist view. One could not run military action under cover of civilian players without seriously challenging the stability of international relations and the trust expressed by all in the word of states. This dimension is all the more important for peacekeeping since new fields recently opened to international security, like cyber war, where these principles will find new areas of application. To conclude, let me say a few words about the variety of forms these lessons can take in the Asia-Pacific area. First, there is the issue of abiding by the rule of law. Here, let me highlight the particular significance of the principles of freedom of navigation at sea and of overflight, which France is deeply attached to, like many of you. This phenomenon, which we call maritimization of the world in France, to illustrate the increasing significance of the stakes related to sea, to its use and to exploitation, this maritimization will significantly mark the 21st century, as it bears so many opportunities and riches, but also so many risks. To contain these risks, we have to defend that right. As a Minister of Defense, I am not the one who can launch an international initiative in terms of law of the sea, but I'm convinced that more than 30 years after the Montego Bay Convention in 1982 was concluded, and when tensions among states are developing about stakes related to the delimitation of sovereign spaces, to their civilian and military usage, I'm particularly referring to the right of innocent passage delimited by the Convention. And I also think the exploitation of these sovereign states. We could think usefully of a possible ambitious effort to preserve and consolidate this common good called the international law of the sea and its corollary in the air domain. There is also this principle of cooperation, including in the military. As a permanent member of the Security Council and as a neighboring power, France plays a full part in the Asia-Pacific area, along with all the players striving for the stability of a region that is at the heart of our interests. These players are here, let me grab this opportunity to welcome Prime Minister Abe's address on Friday night, fostering a new commitment of his country in terms of international security. Cooperation should be privileged when it comes to prevention policies and crisis management. It bears both on force preparation with expertise, advice and education, and on intelligence, on operations, thanks to the numerous exercises organized in the region. The purpose is to give credibility to our ability to act jointly and efficiently with our partners in the region, thanks to improved interoperability. Then there is the significance of dialogue. This is where diplomacy plays its full part to prevent or to solve conflicts. Bilateral dialogue can sometimes foster solving crises and preventing conflicts. But today, you have to rely on preventive diplomacy, which is worked out and implemented by regional organizations. In the Asia-Pacific, let me pay tribute to the major part played by ASEAN, who multiplied the multilateral dialogue and conflicts prevention initiatives. It has brought a key contribution to a regional security architecture that still remains to be strengthened. The role of ASEAN and of its member states has been pivotal in terms of prevention, transparency and cooperation on regional security. ASEAN was the originator of the Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation, the so-called Bali Treaty that France subscribed to in 2007, and it was behind the ARF, ADMM, and ADMM Plus, which is the ADMM extended to non-Asian partners. And lastly, there are these principles of good faith and transparency. Here, France hopes and expects a fast finalization of the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea, which would be the only way to prevent incidents in that coveted area, thanks to establishing shared rules of good neighborhood. I know that the various players concerned are resolutely committed to that endeavor. Only will and good faith are likely to perpetuate this code of conduct expected by all in order to build this more peaceful, stable, and prosperous environment. Let me wish now that ASEAN's leading role in terms of crisis and conflicts prevention develops in the oncoming years. Its contribution to security not only concerns Asia, but also concerns the world. Ladies and gentlemen, France deems as indispensable to safeguard an international order underpinned by peace. France is intending to be an active contributor in this part of the world, thanks to her ability to operate jointly and efficiently with all her partners. Thank you for your attention.
Monsieur Le Drian, thank you very much for your remarks and for continuing to speak to one of the major themes addressed at this year's dialogue, the importance of the rule of law, good faith and transparency, and for your particular proposition that we should all make more of a collective effort to preserve the public good of international maritime and air law. And these are subjects I think we'll want to discuss in our concluding debate. Before that, it's a real pleasure for me to invite to take the podium our host here, the Minister of Defense of the Republic of Singapore, Mr. Ung. Mr. Ung.
John, Minister Le Drian. First, let me wish everyone here welcome. It's a bit late to give you a welcome in the last lecture, but better late than never, and hope that you had a good time. On behalf of my cabinet colleagues here, Deputy Prime Minister Teo Chee Hean, Minister Chan Chun Sing, Minister of State, and Dr. Maliki, We are delighted to be hosts together with my PermSec, Mr. Chan Yen Kit, and CDF, Ms. General Chi Ming. I want to thank you for your very positive comments over the meals that we've had. And many of you have come up unsolicited to say that this year Shangri-La Dialogue has been very successful. And here, John and board members of IIS are to be congratulated for your leadership and your guidance. Some of you have said that the lectures this year are particularly hard-hitting. I share with you this observation, but better hard words than other things that would follow. And if there's a reflection and resolution, I think Shangri-La Dialogue would have played a very positive role. I want to thank you for your presence here, because that's what makes Shangri-La Dialogue, I think, successful. The time that you have committed. And here I want to thank my fellow ministers and heads of delegations. I think the rich exchanges that we have is because of your presence. And I thank the participants. I do want to acknowledge with you the fine role that my officers have played from the Singapore Armed Forces, your many liaison officers that have helped you, and as they say in military parlance, it's the weekend burned, shepherding you, and we want to thank them for the role that they have played. Let me thank you for asking me to speak on Agile conflict management. Being agile presupposes that we can identify or have early warning of conflicts. But I think most of us realize that predicting specific conflicts is risky business. Former U.S. Secretary of State Robert Gates summed it well in a particular West Point speech in 2011. And let me quote him. "When it comes to predicting the nature and location of our next military engagement since Vietnam," Secretary Gates said, "our record has been perfect. We have never once gotten it right." From the Maya guests to Grenada, Panama, Somalia, the Balkans, Haiti, Kuwait, Iraq, and more, we had no idea a year before any of these missions that we would be so engaged. Close quote. So too Ukraine, which reaffirmed our predictive prowess or lack of it. Indeed, a month before Crimea was annexed, I know that a few of us here were at the 50th anniversary of the Munich Security Conference. It was obviously a historic conference, but there was a particular panel discussion that stayed with me. And in this panel, there was former Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, and former French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. They were all together on one panel discussion, so you can envision it in your mind's eye. And in a reflective mood, Mr. d'Estaing remarked that there had been no wars in Europe in the past half-century because, quote, what Europe did was to eliminate the concept of war, unquote. After recent events in Ukraine, Europe looks less stable. I suppose the rejoinder from optimists amongst us is that it is because we expend efforts at preventing conflicts in hotspots that actual conflicts are the unknown unknowns, the unexpected. And I think we certainly hope so. While specific conflicts have been difficult to predict, their impacts are increasingly transnational, given our interconnected world. Again, with reference to Ukraine, growth in Europe could be impacted, particularly for countries that rely heavily on Russian oil and gas. And European countries will also have to decide if military spending needs to increase, because currently many European countries do not meet NATO's defense spending target of 2%. And while Europe's GDP forecast is expected to grow between 1.7% to 2%, fiscal room to expand military spending is challenging. Russia and China recently inked an energy deal. The Does this signal increasing polarization against those partnered and allied with the US? If it is, what would it be based on? Certainly not the competition between ideology, between communism and capitalism. Russia and China are wedded to and dependent on global markets as much as any other country. Indeed, China's deal with Russia is part of its strategic sourcing campaign for energy, mineral resources, and commodities over the last 2 decades, whether with its close neighbors or far-flung places in Australia or Africa. My view is that the polarization will be less when compared to the Cold War, simply because the stakes for all countries are less binary, shades of gray, and not black and white. And countries feel less compulsion to take sides, but will instead weigh the calculus based on their own vested interests. Looking at our region and compared to the past Shangri-La Dialogues, I think all of us here agree that the temperature has gone up. China's announcement of the ADIZ last November elicited strong reactions. Last December, there was a near collision of the USS Cowpens and a Chinese warship. And last month, Chinese and Vietnamese vessels clashed over an oil rig in the South China Sea. Domestic unrest throughout Vietnam occurred with substantial damage and civilian casualties. And added to this, North Korea remains a hotspot. All this is familiar to us here. But if you ask the question, what are the risks of a conflagration in Asia? It's a serious question worth pondering. And at this year's Munich Security Conference, the eminent Mr. Kissinger had observed that present-day Asia is more in a position of a 19th century Europe. And I think what he said is worth quoting. Quote, "I would say Europe is in a position of a postmodern period, reluctant to engage in military conflict. Asia is more in a position of 19th century Europe. It is a state of Asia to not exclude military conflict among each other. And there are conflicts between China and Japan, Vietnam, and some of its neighbors. Plus the problem of an emergent Asia and its relationship with the developed world, which is often summed up by the analogy of Britain and Germany in the 19th century. It is a state of Asia not to exclude military conflict, a dim prognosis. Is Mr. Kissinger right? Defense spending in Asia has indeed gone up against world trends. While global military expenditure fell for the second consecutive year, Asia's defense expenditure last year increased by 3.6% to now US $381 billion, with China estimated to have contributed to half the region's total defense spending. Increases in South Korea's defending spending now rank it the 10th biggest military spender in the world, following closely behind Japan and India. Militaries in Asean and Australia have also pledged to increase, if not maintain, their defense spending. This militarization of many countries within Asia on this scale has no historical precedent. What safeguards and structures exist to mitigate fallouts in Asia? Certainly less than those that exist in Europe. Unresolved historical baggage and animosities exist between China, Japan, and Korea. And it's viscerally felt within their populations, and therefore fertile ground to be whipped up by nationalistic instincts. While the three countries, Japan, Korea, and China, institutionalized an annual trilateral summit in 2008, they last met 2 years ago, and frequent high-level visits between them are a rarity. ASEAN has made strides, as Minister Drian has mentioned, but certainly not in the breadth or depth when compared to the EU or NATO. The ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting is still a young forum, established only in 2006, and the ADMM Plus, younger still, only inaugurated 4 years ago. But beyond these reasons, there is another stark deficit that exists in Asia when it comes to the avoidance of conflict. Asia does not have the equivalent of the never again resolve that bound all of Europe after 2 world wars, and that translated into political will to create formal structures and alliances to avoid war, to eliminate, as President Sting said, the concept of war in Europe. Instead, Asian countries only share a common struggle for independence, but desperately fought. On that score, Asian countries are still relatively young, beginning with Vietnam gaining independence in 1945, Singapore gained independence in 1965, and the last nation of ASEAN that gained independence was Brunei in 1984. The civil and social institutions are still evolving and in Kuwait. Some countries in Asia are not traditional democracies. Unlike Europe, there is no binding aversion to regional conflict. The restraining force hitherto has been economic development for each own's interests, first supported in large measure by the US as it provided the strategic security umbrella for the region, and subsequently fueled by China's economic development in the last 2 decades. Converging economic interests of different Asian countries have indeed brought wealth and progress to this region. Asia was a star performer in this last decade, even after the global financial crisis in 2008. Since their introduction to the global market, India's real GDP per capita has more than tripled, while China's has increased 12-fold. Within ASEAN, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Philippines have mostly been growing steadily between 5 to 7% since 2010, and by some reports projected to be among the world's top 20 economies by 2050 in terms of GDP. This is a positive trajectory for Asia. But what happens when competition for resources, or graver still, sovereignty disputes escalate? Or when fears of domination prevail over consensus and fair competition? Or when economic projections do not come true and the engines of growth within Asia stall, even momentarily? Or when existing social and political structures are challenged due to a rising middle class? I have said that for Asia, a collective never again resolve does not exist. But it does for individual countries. For China, who will celebrate 100 years of the founding of the CCP in 2021, it never again wants a repeat of the century of humiliation and unequal treaties that China was subjected to in the 19th century. In this narrative, a strong China would never have been forced to give up large swaths of land to encroaching and invading foreigners. Part of the Chinese dream articulated by President Xi is thus to achieve, quote, the great revival of the Chinese nation through uniting and leading of the people, in order for China to stand more firmly and powerfully among all nations. A strong China, unquote. Japan wants to move on to the baggage of World War II. We've heard President Abe in this conference, Prime Minister Abe. A new Japanese in a normal Japan. Never again does Japan want to see the horrific destruction from 2 atomic bombs. Japan wants to move forward and claim its rightful place in the global economy of the 21st century as a normal country. ASEAN member states never again want to be colonized or exploited, or become a proxy playground for bigger powers. ASEAN member states want higher standards of living that other regions enjoy as independent and sovereign nations. The political challenge before us is to ensure that these circles of aspirations and ambitions of individual countries intersect as widely as possible to protect the global commons of peace and stability. Recent incidents in the East and South China Seas do not give the reassurance that Asia's trajectory is on this virtuous path. Asia must therefore build more resilient mechanisms to forge consensus and political will. And here I agree with my colleague, Minister Drian, political will, to prevent, if not mitigate, conflicts. Asia must not backslide into a fractious environment riven by confrontational nationalism and lack of mutual trust. Many have pointed out that strategic trust among Asian countries is lacking. We need to have open and frank dialogue on security challenges, like we are doing here, before they can be meaningfully addressed. Asia must build on multilateral frameworks to achieve this trust, anchored on common principles and shared values that promote peace and stability. For regional security, the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting, as well as the ADMM Plus framework, with its 8 extra-regional partners, serve as platforms for open and inclusive dialogue to resolve differences peacefully. We must also step up practical cooperation and interaction between militaries to forge understanding and trust. This was the aim in the joint ADMM Plus exercise held last year, hosted by Brunei, where 18 countries with 18 militaries conducted a large HADR and military medicine exercise. The ADMM Plus militaries will do more, including the next joint counter-terrorism and maritime security exercise. A key platform to achieve trust is concerted action to help one another in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. Recent natural disasters such as Typhoon Haiyan showed the need for a 24/7 crisis center to coordinate military and civilian efforts in the most crucial first 24 to 48 hours of disaster. This was the reason why Singapore put forward a proposal to host a regional HADR coordination center, which would complement existing frameworks such as the ASEAN Humanitarian Assistance Center and will add to and strengthen the existing regional crisis architecture. Friends and distinguished guests, crisis and conflicts are unpredictable. But we can reduce that uncertainty by proactively building among us strong relations and multilateral frameworks that build trust and confidence through cooperation and consensus. A stronger and more stable Asia will benefit all our citizens and the world. Thank you very much for your attention.
Minister, thank you very much for that sober and careful analysis that we have come to know as typical of Singapore's strategic habit of mind. I think, to use a French phrase, the intriguing strategic aperçu that you brought to this debate was that while individual countries in the Asia Pacific do not ever want to see themselves at war, Asia does not yet have that collective never again resolve that was developed in Europe, begging in effect the question of how this serial individual reluctance to engage in conflict can be transposed into a genuine collective will to avoid conflict, which is, of course, the ultimate and continuing purpose of efforts like this Shangri-La Dialogue. The floor is now open. As I implied in my opening remarks, I welcome people who will try to bring the threads of our discussion to our conclusion, inspired by the 2 strategic statements that we've heard this morning. David Howell of the UK.
John, thank you for calling me, and thank you for inviting me to this, my first Shangri-La Dialogue, which I have to say straight away I found both brilliant but also rather disturbing, given that we are now sitting here at the centre of the 21st century world, not at the edge of it, but at the epicentre, and given that, of course, the hegemony of the West, of the West-dominated world, has now passed, and we have to see things in a new perspective. I have to just briefly observe on the question of agile management of conflicts, given the European track record in the first half of the 20th century. I don't think we've got very much to teach on that matter, except possibly to urge that the rest of the world and the new world learns from our mistakes. I have a question, and it's this, a theme question, although touched on by our 2 brilliant speakers we just heard. We all want America as a close partner. One couldn't want anything else, and we in Europe never forget that the United States saved us 60 years ago from total self-destruction. But I also have to ask the question and wonder whether the leaders of the Asian region also shouldn't ask whether we want America as the leader. Does Asia want the American engagement to be in the form of partnership or as leadership, given that in a network world and in an age of digital empowerment and soft power, the sheer size of defense expenditure and hard power deployment no longer determines size of influence or the persuasive impact or the capacity to resolve many conflicts. In the British Foreign Office, in which I had good fortune to serve, one of the adages of the past was that the job of the diplomats was to prevent second-class issues being escalated into first-class conflicts. And that remains the task. It seems to me it's one that the Asians themselves have to develop and learn. And how much can America help? It, to some degree, but do they want America to be the leader of the entire pattern of conflict resolution in Asia, or should they not work for it themselves? Thank you.
Thank you. And from Japan, Haruhisa Takeuchi.
Thank you very much. May I first of all congratulate IWS for yet another success of the Shangri-La Dialogue, and thank you for the government of Singapore for its hospitality, which is already a tradition. This year, may I remind you and reiterate that Mr. Prime Minister Abe gave a keynote speech in which he emphasized rule of law and proactive contribution to peace. And we will prove ourselves that Japan is a positive force in Asia-Pacific and the world, not by words, but by actions and transparency. Now, my question is to both ministers. Since the title of this session is Ensuring Agile Conflict Management, could you enlighten us how in this modern world the need to react swiftly come to balance with securing domestic consent to such actions? Thank you very much.
And from Indonesia, Professor Dewi Fortuna Anwar.
Thank you, John. I would also like to congratulate both speakers for truly inspiring speeches, although a bit scary as well. I'd like to have a question first to the Minister of Defense from France. You emphasize the importance of compliance to the rules of law, that should not be any violations of international law. And you've mentioned about the role of the international body, the United Nations Security Council, for example, in areas of conflicts where it has acted very decisively when there's been a violation of that law, but on a land base. Now, I'm just wondering whether there is such a kind of international will to act decisively according to international law if there is a violation of international law in the maritime domain. How does it translate? What would the UN Security Council do if something were really horrible were to happen in the South China Sea? Or would it be left just to us to muddle it through in the Asia-Pacific region? That's one question. Secondly, to Minister of Defense, Minister Ang from Singapore, in your very impassioned speech about the need for us to strengthen our multilateral structure, regional security structure, you didn't mention the East Asia Summit at all. In Prime Minister Abe's speech, we know that he mentioned about the need to strengthen the East Asia Summit. And in fact, some ideas have been floated about using this as the premier regional security structure in the Asia-Pacific region. What is your own thinking in this arena? Thank you.
Thank you. And from China, Senior Colonel Zhou Bu.
Good morning, John. My question goes to French Defense Minister. I'm very happy you have mentioned Mali from time to time. In fact, one of the contributions made by China toward its international responsibility is peacekeeping. And most of China's peacekeeping missions are found in Africa. The most important thing is that last year, we, for the first time in our history, have sent the combat troops to Mali. So my question to you is how could the major powers, including both of us, could contribute to peacekeeping in Africa? Thank you.
And from India, Lieutenant General Singh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I must say that we've been talking of temperatures rising, but very heartening that nobody talked of conflict, nobody talked of war. That's a very heartening sign. However, I have... yesterday we heard the Vietnamese defense minister, and when asked about the present situation between Vietnam and China, he was emphatic in saying that as a last resort, as a very last resort, they will go for international arbitration. But today I understand what the Chinese delegate, General Wang, said was they will not go for arbitration. Now, how do we resolve a situation like this? And to add to that, the problem is that we've all accepted and we all say that the security architecture in this part in Asia Pacific is not strong enough not to resolve these issues, to prevent, to manage the issues thereafter. So will we let these festering wounds carry on, or will we accept these fait accomplis and then say, hey, we'll talk of other issues in future? And as Dr. Chipman said about being agile, could we have been agile when we saw the Chinese rig and the flotilla moving, making some statements about it? Or will we wait? So I know it's very difficult to be preventive. How do we move ahead? Will it all be just talk, or will there be some action? Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And last question in this round. We'll come back to the panel after this, and then we'll go back to the floor. Tim Huxley.
Thank you very much, John. My question is for Singapore's Defence Minister, Dr. Ang. I wonder if the Minister could please say something about how Singapore's defence policy and armed forces are being adapted to the need to respond to perhaps unpredictable emerging threats to the security of this island and its region. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, as I say, we will go back in a few minutes. Might I invite Singapore Defence Minister to address first the questions that were put to him, and then to Minister of Defence of France. Dr. Hung.
Thank you, John, and thank you for the questions. Lord Powell asked, do Asian countries see the U.S. as continuing to play the role of a leader or close partner? I would say that on the record, Singapore's position has been very clear, that the U.S. presence in the last half century has been a benign and stabilizing force. I remember a quote from the previous Indonesian minister, no less, Professor Juwono, who explicitly said and acknowledged that it was without the U.S. strategic umbrella providing that stability for this region that he doubted if emerging economies could have developed. And I would include China in that list. Without that security which the U.S. provided, this region could not have progressed as fast, if at all. The second point is it realistic to expect a U.S. withdrawal? I think it would be catastrophic. I think nature abhors a vacuum. And we have said that while U.S. continues to play a dominant role, that it has to accommodate other rising powers, including China, India, Asean. And it is that accommodation which we are presently grappling with. And I took to heart, and it was actually a positive comment by General Wang just now, who said that we should expect from time to time in this process of accommodation that China and U.S. will not always agree, and it was a very mature view, but that they continue to move forward. And it was for this particular reason that the ASEAN defense ministers first held our inaugural meeting of ASEAN defense ministers and then agreed that there would be 8 extra-regional partners. And I think that has progressed, not only from a point of dialogue, but military-to-military cooperation. The fact that we could hold an 18-nation military exercise assembled just near the shores of Brunei and then entering into Brunei with cross-deck deployments of U.S. to Chinese ships, with U.S., Chinese, Japanese soldiers all performing the same functions, spoke volumes of the confidence building that occurred. So this would be our position, Singapore's position, and we will continue to work hard in the ADMM. Let me just also briefly address some of the other questions. John, you said you were keen on the title Agile Conflict Management, and my response was that I'm not sure we can be agile because whatever is unpredictable is hard to respond to. And my point was that we really ought to be spending time preempting, as some of you have mentioned, building the confidence, because one presupposes that the specific threat is undefinable, and you really have to have the confidence and trust. And one of the more positive aspects, if you like, there were 2. One was Typhoon Haiyan, where the international community, including Singapore, responded, but that showed up a gap in terms of crisis management. But the second, as my colleague, the Malaysian minister, would tell you, was, as he did, was MH370. He shared how he had to call on the Vietnamese defense minister and ask if Chinese ships could search in Vietnamese EEZ, and Defense Minister Tang agreed, and he shared how Indonesia allowed flights over its airspace. And I think it's this building of confidence that allows us to be agile. Mr. Singh asked about Vietnam and how our architecture is responding or seen to be adequate or inadequate to conflicts. I would say this. I think no one expects resolution of sovereignty disputes, even over a short period. But what has been useful is, among our platforms and dialogue sessions, the ability to introduce, if you like, de-escalating measures. So specifically, Brunei suggested hotlines between ASEAN and extra-regional partners, including China, which is a good idea, which is being followed up. Vietnam proposed a first no use of force, which was again an interesting idea for us to dwell on and to develop. Lastly, Tim Huxley's question on how Singapore has adapted our defense capabilities to a wider spectrum of threats, and indeed we have. I would say, in terms of how, first of all, is mindset to expect the unexpected and a wider spectrum of challenges for the military. I would say just over the last decade, the expectation that militaries respond to civilian disasters in almost all countries that we engage with has become a norm. It's expected for the military to step forward very quickly. And that wasn't the norm, say, 2 decades ago. So that's certainly a mindset that has shifted and incorporated in the mindset mission that it is part of the mission of the SAF to respond to a wide spectrum of threats, including cybersecurity, including humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, and obviously, finally, our ORBAT, how we construct and how our people are trained.
Monsieur Le Drian.
Thank you, Mr. President. One question was asked directly to me by the representative of China. It was about China. That makes it possible for me to comment further about this. First of all, to thank China for her presence in the peacekeeping operation, as well as other partners, and also to call our common vigilance on the risks of terrorism that are developing in that part of the world, and which concern not only Africa, not only Mali. There's a route of trafficking weapons, human beings, that make it possible for fundamentalists to be prosperous, and they are threatening the security of Africa. This Saharan part of Africa, but also, of course, Africa and other parts of the world, because these traffickings and these movements carry on all the way to the Near East, and sometimes originate in South America. So France's intervention there in the Malian crisis was both for the security of Mali, but also for our common security, and the fact that the United Nations had displayed the indispensable vigilance is something which is very determining for the follow-on. Other zones are actually fragile. Not only Mali. I want to mention the Central African Republic. We can talk about Nigeria. There is an instability area in Nigeria which is far, of course, far from Asia, because for geographical reasons, but which is close to the security stakes in this Asia-Pacific area. On the other questions, there were more focus dedicated to my colleague, but let me, however, make one or two comments. It was said that Europe declared war as something which is outlawed, because traumas ended up in this never again thing. But it's all because this comes out of the fact that Europe has also created self-security political structures and bodies to try and avoid any kind of new conflict, and it ended up in solving peacefully, as peacefully as possible, the tensions that might exist, and to answer the questions that I felt in the questions that were more dedicated to my colleague. I believe that as far as the Asia Pacific is concerned, the triptych, risk prevention and a necessity to build up a common architecture, which is indispensable, in what you were saying, made it possible to see the path that could be trodden to get there, even if they're still very long. And if Europe could bring their contribution through its old history and the way it was faced to numerous wars, and it ended up saw the necessity of common alliance and among partners. The second point is the determination to enforce law. The main body of my words, my comments, were based on abiding by international law, common prevention, a firm determination of law, and also measures of confidence and dialogue to initiate de-escalation. I've been here for the third time. What I noticed here is, during this dialogue this year, more tensions can be sensed in the whole area, but also simultaneously a strong will to build up a common security architecture. I hope the second point will go faster than the first one.
Alors, je voulais répondre à une autre question de l'Indonésie, donc concernant le sommet de l'Asie de l'Est. Nous voulons nous rassurer que le ministre de la Défense singapourien soutient fermement ce forum, et nous nous réjouissons des commentaires du Premier ministre, M. Abe. Et je vais donc m'ajouter à cela.
To build trust, and not defense platforms or dialogue platforms, but I'm referring to the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the RCEP, the Regional Cooperative Agreements. Because we think that trade As Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong said, in Asia, trade is strategic.
Thank you. So we'll go back for a quick other round. Could I invite Dr. Tsuke Ayo, Japan? Go ahead. No, if you speak, if the mic is red, it's on, so just speak. Just speak.
Is it on? Okay,
yes,
thank you so
on.
much. Thank you so much.
The light's red in front of you.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak, Mr. Chair. My question is addressed to both speakers. For the French Minister of Defense, Monsieur Drian, thank you so much for mentioning again the continued relevance and importance of stabilization agenda in Africa and various other parts of the world. I was glad to hear about both France's and China's contribution in this area. And my question for you is, does France have any specific policy institutions or venues to share your very vast experiences in stabilization and peace operations with Asia-Pacific nations specifically? And also, do you have any defense engagement policy to entice, perhaps, not only the large states like China or Japan into, this type of operations, but to bring up and entice some more smaller newcomer nations to peace operations, such as, in the region, Cambodia and Vietnam, do you have an engagement policy to entice these countries to develop more capabilities, to participate more in this type of more difficult operations? And my question for the Singapore Minister of Defense, Dr. Hen, is that recently we hear a lot of we hear a lot about humanitarian assistance, disaster relief operations in the region, and there is a lot of training going on and so on. But I wonder if in the region, perhaps in ASEAN, there is more focused talk about developing peacekeeping, peace-building, and stabilization capabilities in the region, perhaps undertaken jointly within the region. The reason I ask you this is that perhaps for geostrategic differences between Europe and Asia that you just very articulately described, perhaps there is a de facto division of labor that's developing where Europe is so much concerned about Africa, stabilization, more difficult situations, and Asia tend to have a more unbalanced capabilities in this area, therefore tend to stand back a little bit, perhaps more concerned about natural disasters in the region and so on. So I would like to hear your opinions about this. Thank you.
Nick Bisley, Australia.
Thanks, John. What I'm going to say might sound a little heretical in this context, but I think given what we've seen over the past day or so, is that trust is in short supply. And we need more of it. But frankly, the track record of multilateral processes, of confidence-building measures, of a range of different platforms, both ASEAN-centred and otherwise, aren't delivering trust. In fact, what we've shown is that we can chew gum and walk at the same time in quite an unpleasant way, which is we can talk to each other whilst busy preparing to fight each other. And I think we really need some more creative approaches to how it is that we can begin to develop trust. And perhaps trust is too ambitious. Perhaps what we need to do is begin to think about how do we find some basic sense of common cause, recognise differences of opinion, recognise where interests do not converge, talk openly and frankly about that, and then begin to develop ways in which we can work together to do the really heavy lifting that Minister Ng was pointing out about accommodating and changing the existing order to reflect the seismic changes that have gone on, because there's a sense that we can just continue to pretend it's 2002 and the American dominance is fine, China gets on with economic development and we're all okay, and yet the world has changed dramatically. We talk about Haidar and all these other things, and yet we don't get anywhere. So I think it's time for a bit of honesty about what works and what doesn't, and some creative thinking, and I'd be interested in the panellists' thoughts on how we could do that.
And from Korea, Dr. Chul Woo Kim.
Okay, one of the missing points of this intriguing discussion so far is the media's role, particularly broadcasting media's coverage, even regarding the Shangri-La Dialogue. Is very interesting to me, and most of us here at this site have never been to North Korea, but we have a clear image toward Mr. Kim Jong-un, who made that framework. What I'm saying is, instead of de-escalating the crisis in all the areas, all the international media's agile crisis-making news network is the problematic, particularly individual countries' chauvinistic, nationalistic coverage of the certain crisis making things worse. What's your response, particularly from the last night I saw your news coverage, Defense Minister of Singapore, through the News Asia. So it was very focal point to the certain dignitaries instead of in detailed discussions of this intriguing so far. So what I'm saying is that media's role in this day and age, particularly broadcasting media's coverage, is very important. What are you thinking about that?
And from the U.S., Bonnie Glaser.
Yes, thank you, John, and congratulations on another successful Shangri-La Dialogue. I'd like to ask the Minister of Defense from Singapore, in the area of conflict management, dispute settlement, there's been discussion of many various mechanisms that can be applied in pursuit of those objectives. And, of course, a lot of discussion about international law. And I wonder if you could address the degree to which you think it is useful for states to avail themselves of mechanisms of international arbitration, such as the ITLOS Tribunal, that the Philippines has a case that is now pending, or the International Court of Justice. Do you see these as legitimate? Do you see these as positive mechanisms to promote dispute settlement and conflict management? Thank you.
And Dr. Cho Un Kong, please.
Yeah, my question is for Minister Drian. Minister, you spoke approvingly of Prime Minister Abe's opening address to this conference. We've just heard this morning some strong criticism of Prime Minister Abe's remarks from General Wang. And this made me wonder if you could enlighten us from a European perspective. What is your view of General Wang's remarks? Thank you.
And Bill Cohen.
Thank you, John, and let me thank the panel for a really fine presentation. The question was asked, what role should the United States play as a partner, as a leader in the Asia-Pacific region? And I think that's a fundamental issue because Secretary Hagel yesterday tried to point out that the United States is taking some very concrete measures to continue to provide a stabilizing effect for all of the Asia-Pacific region. Doubt has been raised in the minds of many in this part of the world about the capability, but more importantly about the willpower. Is there a willpower to sustain the kind of commitment that has kept not only the peace, but has been able to help generate the prosperity that has taken place over the past several decades, to be sure. So Secretary Hagel was criticized for being too open, too blunt, too direct, too confrontational, too provocative. And so it raises the issue, frankly, I think this particular dialogue has been the best. It's been the best because it shows a certain maturity, that we welcome our Chinese friends here. We're able to address issues openly and hopefully not in a hostile fashion, but to raise the issues at a level to say these are some of the issues that could, in fact, lead very quickly to a conflict. So we have to find ways to reduce that. The question I have is, what role do you want us to play? Do you want us to be a quote, a partner, leading not from behind, but certainly from the middle, if not in the front? And to me, it's unresolved when I listen to some of the comments being made. It's almost like the prayer of St. Augustine. Dear Lord, give me chastity, but not just yet. And I hear this, give us security, but not too much. So I'd like to know from the panel exactly what is it you would like from the United States to provide in the way of military presence, diplomatic presence, economic assistance. What role would you like us to play? And that will help define what we are able to go back and persuade the American citizens through the Congress to continue to play.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, we'll take a couple of very quickies if people restrict themselves to one question, 1 minute. Dr. Wang Yiwei of China.
Thank you. My question to our host, Singapore. You mentioned about Dr. Kissinger's Asia live in 19th century Europe. I don't think so. It's still, my personal view, is a past Americana. It's not, an anarchy. When I very worried about it because of the relative decline of the U.S., many nations question about the credibility of the U.S. Leadership. Then the U.S. Outsourcing is regional power or leadership to Japan. Japan used this the active peacefulness. Many people just focus on the active because you cut the military budget, so you welcome Japan's positive active participant. But we worry about the pacifism. Given that the Premier Shinzo Abe mentioned about his generation, it's the same with the father's generation and the grandfather's generation, which I heard are totally different in Germany. Today's German the generation always say, our generation is totally different with the Hitler's generation. So I very worried about as the victims of the Second World War, of the Chinese and the Koreans. Please understand that this question is not unfriendly, but it's a very concern of the Chinese people from the historical memory of that. How to can guarantee that this active peacefulness is really peace, is sustainable and long peace for not only for Asia, not only for the U.S. and Japan, but also for the whole Asian people.
Thank you.
A quick comment to Monsieur Lefranc. You mentioned
very
about
quickly.
Very quickly. You mentioned about your joint alliance with to contribute positively in Asia's peace and security. You know, France is a P5 EU member and a NATO member. So, which identity you particularly mentioned of your contribution as the EU's NATO positive contribution? How can guarantee to be positive? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert Asean.
Thanks very much, John. One of my conclusions from this really interesting dialogue has been that the issue of the rule of law and international law is extremely important in Asia's maritime commons, but it's only important to the extent that China is included in an understanding and an agreement about what some of those principles are. So my question is, how can those principles be presented in a way that China will find reassuring, including issues such as freedom of navigation and overflight?
Thank you. And last intervention from the floor today, Dr. Chikako Ueki. One question, please.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask about the ASEAN's role. I think it's been very, very beneficial, and especially as the competition and rivalry between major powers seems to be continuing and rising, I think it will continue to play a role. However, if the rivalry goes a little too far, I am concerned about the sort of the gradual approach that ASEAN up till now has taken. So my question is ASEAN willing to take a more enforcement measure in applying the principles of this region? Otherwise, I fear that ASEAN may not be in the driver's seat and providing this kind of a buffer and a forum for other nations in this region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chikuku Ueki, for your last question. And I will now turn first to Monsieur Jean-Yves Drian to pull together the threads as he sees it from the debate that we've just heard in 2 or 3 minutes, and then I'll give the last word to Minister Ung, including to try to address this last issue that Chikuku you just raised about whether ASEAN might contemplate an enforcement mechanism at all as part of agile conflict management, as it were. So first, Monsieur Yves Le Drian.
Thank you, John. The question by the Chinese representative, the very last one, was both relevant and a little bit insolent. And this is in very friendly words. I understand that the question was basically, what am I doing here? And let me answer as frankly as possible, as friendly as possible. First of all, you are certainly aware that France is a neighboring state of the Pacific Ocean, and in the Asia Pacific there are French territories. So that's a given. Second, we are also a member of the UN Security Council, as you kindly reminded, and deriving from that, we have responsibilities, which are both abiding by international law, and we are also committed to peacekeeping and crisis resolution in this respect. And you certainly haven't forgotten that France is a nuclear power, and that we have obligations in counter-proliferation in this respect. And we also are a military power, a normal military power, and we have bilateral strategic players with a certain number of countries in the Asia Pacific, and military assets stationed in the Indian and the Pacific Ocean. So this is the reason why I'm here, and this is said with a touch of humor. There was a question also about a very precise question about the fact that I could have said oppose Japan to China. I don't think, this is not my point of view. France has good relationships with those two countries. And if I refer to what Prime Minister Abe said on Friday, was to express my pleasure to see Japan striving for an international dimension in a more impulsive way than before. So this had to be recognized, and I think this is a positive contribution. The criticism by Mr. Wong to Mr. Abe, I didn't hear them, but my viewpoint is in those questions of territorial conflicts or maritime territorial conflicts, the dialogue and law must prevail, and we wish that every possible instrument to solve disputes are there, especially between friendly states which are friends. The third question was directly after my words, are about the peacekeeping operations. We consider, especially in Africa, we consider that the peacekeeping operations are key to re-establish security. Let me say first that there's sort of preamble to the question. All this makes sense only if the African countries implement and display the resources that made it possible to get the tools that would be theirs, that they need. They expressed it within the African Union. That's good. It's useful. But they still don't have the implementation of them or coming into force. One of our jobs, collective jobs, and this, as the role of the Europeans, but not only the Europeans, is to go along with this collective implementation, so that there would be rapid deployment forces, an agile management of African crisis that could be a specific African agility. We still haven't gone there, but in the meantime, there's a necessity to implement the tools that are related to the UN. It is true in Somalia, it is true in Sudan, it's true in Mali, in Central African Republic, and it's also true that it is necessary that there is undoubtedly a larger mobilization of the international community for that kind of intervention. For instance, tomorrow the intervention force in Central African Republic will be set up, and it would be relevant that further participants declare themselves to the United States, to the United Nations, because this is necessary. So the lesson learned on the initiatives to train small countries, for instance, for peacekeeping operations, this already exists in Cambodia. There is a school in Cambodia that had been initially launched by France, and now the officers there are trained for peacekeeping operations. There are other similar operations that could be encouraged. France is willing to provide any partner who would like to peacekeeping operations to provide its experience. I think I answered the 3 questions that were directly asked to me. I would like to conclude with a point. I already said that before. Any kind of dispute settlement is good to take, and I think with crisis prevention, especially in the Asia Pacific, any kind of is by implementation of common collective tools. And since France is a member is a state in the Pacific, France is willing to contribute.
I know time is late, and I'll try to answer the questions briefly within a couple of minutes. So excuse me if I'm brief, but I'll be happy to continue the conversations. Secretary Cohen, thank you for your remarks. I presume that question was not only to Singapore, but everyone else. But for Singapore, it's been very clear. We signed an MOU, as you remember, when Minister Lee Kuan Yew was Prime Minister, and we reaffirmed and expanded that under the Strategic Framework Agreement under the current Prime Minister and President George Bush, which now facilitates the use of our naval bases and airports for the U.S. military. As I said openly, and many defense ministers and our leaders have said, we believe in the U.S. presence in this region, and we believe that no one else except the U.S. can play the role. How it accommodates rising powers, including China and India, will be something that we have to address. There was a question on PKO addressed to me, and I would say that we do have peacekeeping operations individually for ASEAN members. For example, we were in Timor-Leste and together with other countries in New Zealand. We were in international stabilization and assistance efforts in Bamiyan and the south of Afghanistan, Oruzgan, together with the Australians and the Dutch. But it is true, as a collective entity for ASEAN, we have paid more attention to HADR than PKO, and I think there's a specific reason for it. Statistically, 80% of natural disasters occur in our region. So I think it's sensible to place our emphasis there, but I can foresee that there may be collective, if not all, among some of the ASEAN member states. There was a question on trust, indeed, and that's something that we have to work on. And the way we are doing it is very practical, as I mentioned, the military-to-military cooperation and the regional HADR center, which Singapore has proposed to facilitate, and we'll get on it because we have support from other countries. There was a difficult question on how to manage the media, which I really don't want to answer. But thank you if you think the coverage has been good. But let me just say that it is part and parcel of what we call our standard operating procedure. And I'll give a specific example. If you remember the London bomb blast, we sent representatives, meaning the Ministry of Home Affairs, sent representatives to learn because they managed their media very well. Not only on not just binary yes or no, but giving the information to the media beforehand, giving precise information. And one of the key points from the exercise was that you have to cultivate the media before something happens, and that's intuitive and to most of us. So that's a key learning point. There were questions asked about from Ms. Glazer and Minister Asean from New Zealand in terms of the rule of law. I think we ought to be realistic that sovereignty issues for certain countries, it would be political suicide to subject themselves to arbitration because you really can't decide the outcome. And I don't think that every dispute lends itself to it, and that's the reality. But there are other positive examples short of dispute settlements. For Singapore, we were able to go with Malaysia. There was a dispute, and we went to ICJ for Petrabangka. There were some disputes between Indonesia and Malaysia that were subject itself. But short of that, there have been positive examples that we should cite and encourage us to move towards. For example, my colleague, the UK Defence Minister, Philip Hammond, said, for example, Norway had a dispute with Russia, and there was a resolution. Nearer home, many of us will be familiar that Taiwan concluded a fisheries agreement with Japan over disputed waters. And that's a positive example. There are other examples of delimitation. So I think there are a number of mechanisms within arbitration which finally, obviously, for sovereignty disputes, but there is sufficient leeway for us to have confidence-building measures to be able to move it. As we said, freedom of navigation is less of an issue. China has assured countries, and I think we should take them at their word. Fisheries is possible. Hydrocarbon reserves is probably the most difficult, and precious minerals and so on and so forth. There was a question from Mr. Wang, comments about U.S. outsourcing security to Japan. Well, I'm sure others will respond to that. But I would add this point, and which we've said to the Chinese leadership. We say to China that you are now a power, and you have to decide, if you like, to construct or provide the rules in which preserves the global commons. China's response is, that's not our model of a global power. I think most of us would agree that de facto China is already playing it. And it has to evolve a set of principles that both itself and others can agree to, that we can decide what the framework is. And that's, I think, a key in our conversations with the Chinese leadership. And finally, on ASEAN, yes, we agree that ASEAN has to step up and that its position is not ordained, or not preordained, or self-appointed because it's a great source of power, because that's not the situation. And I think from time to time, sometimes ASEAN steps up, sometimes it doesn't. But I would say that in the recent dispute following the ASEAN Leaders Summit, if you remember, there was a joint statement regarding incidents in the South China Sea, and occasions like this add to credibility of the ASEAN. For the South China Sea, it has evolved, if you like, the Declaration of Conduct, Implementation Guidelines, COC, the 6-point principle, the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. So in that sense, I think ASEAN has evolved positive contributions in terms of what the practices and principles which maintain our stability. Thank you very much.
Minister, thank you very much indeed. Minister, thank you very much indeed, not least for giving a really excellent answer to a question that you claimed you didn't want to answer on the way in which government should engage with the media. Allow me to draw a conclusion to the 13th ISS Shangri-La Dialogue. I think it was right and proper that we had at this conclusion a senior minister from Europe and a senior minister from the Asia Pacific, because it demonstrated how we live in this very interconnected world where conflicts sadly commute. Indeed, because of the fact we live in what David Howell calls a networked world, the domestic politics of one country can quickly become the domestic politics of another country, and not necessarily even simply a neighboring country. And fighters who export themselves to fight in foreign lands can sometimes re-import themselves back to the lands from which they came, trained and equipped to create problems there. So it has been this drama of the internet-connected world that we've in part been addressing at this Shangri-La Dialogue, where a couple of themes have emerged, the most powerful one of which was underscoring the need at every turn to uphold and respect the rule of law, to work towards more transparency, to ensure that norms that are proclaimed can in some fashion be enforced. We heard a great deal also about history, and it brought to mind the aphorism of the English novelist Julian Barnes about history. And his aphorism is that history is that certainty produced at the point where the imperfections of memory meet the inadequacy of documentation. And I think that is one of the many reasons why discussions about history become so complex. But happily, a huge amount of the discussion was future-orientated and about how we grapple with the conflicts of the day by developing norms that are adequate for the future to which we're moving. And I'm happy to have the support of people like William Cohen to say that this has been perhaps the most successful Shangri-La Dialogue precisely because the debate has been both transparent and so future-orientated. And indeed, the spirit that we have always tried to inculcate at the Shangri-La Dialogue is genuine frankness, not just that frankness that is sometimes talked about in diplomatic parlance, but a real frankness, but a frankness that is intended to look towards the future. And this allows me to thank our comrades at the Ministry of Defense in the Republic of Singapore, but not just the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the police, the many other agencies of government that have hosted us here at the Shangri-La Dialogue, and indeed the people of Singapore who've tolerated the slight changes in traffic that our presence here has inspired over this weekend. So I hope you will all join me in thanking the Republic of Singapore and its people for hosting this Shangri-La Dialogue this year. I'd also, of course, like to take this important opportunity to thank the staff of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. We at the IISS spend quite a lot of time following military developments, and one of the most recent military developments is the requirement of all militaries to become leaner, but somehow more efficient as well. And I'm very proud that this year we have the largest ever Shangri-La Dialogue with 451 delegates, but several thousand badges to be produced, and therefore several thousand people with whom we had to engage. And we had not more than 12 or 13 IISS staff members supporting several thousand people who were in some fashion or other engaged in this Shangri-La Dialogue. So I think the IISS tooth-to-tail ratio is impressive, and I want to thank all members of the ISS staff for the extraordinary and good-humored contribution they have made to ensuring, in collaboration with the Republic of Singapore, the very efficient management of this 13th Shangri-La Dialogue.